Welcome to United Jews channel.
Okay, great. So can we move on to the interest of people, Ukrainians and Russians? So what do you believe these people want? Who can speak on behalf of Ukrainians?
I'm Texan, so I have my fiance and my friends that in Ukraine, but I let somebody closer to the situation answer.
Oh, I can speak on behalf of Ukrainians. I think I think I know. So one thing that is, I mean, on one hand, these are very neighbor ethnical groups, right? Russians and Ukrainians are very mixed with each other. But there is a national flavor in what people are thinking in Ukraine versus in Russia. And people in Ukraine tend to be more independent. They want to integrate with the West. They want to travel, they want to work there, they want to learn English, and they want to participate in the global workforce. So, and that was an expression that was expressed in 2014. This Orange Revolution is exactly that. So Yanukovych was not, was like Putin's puppet. And that, so regular people in Ukraine, as far as I know, they are, most of them are very poor. And that is similar to Russia. Russians are also very poor. And by the way, if you think about it, I mean, sometimes, like, on one hand, I'm angry at Russians for what they're doing. But on another hand, when I'm thinking, what could I expect from people who, who have toilet on the outside, who live in that level of poverty, and they're fed with lies of propaganda, and they're giving weapons, and they are forcefully sent to somewhere outside of their country, saying that they are going to defend, their homeland.
And they will get money for doing that.
Yes, and they will get money, which they aren't getting, because that's another whole level of internal lies that is in play there as well. So I think an important aspect is that Ukrainians, they have enough of this self-awareness and understanding of geopolitics to the point that they want to affiliate with the West more than with Russia. And that is a critical piece that I think Putin and his administration didn't understand. He just ignored that. He just didn't think that Ukrainians can have any opinion.
Thank you, Dmitry. Who else wants to talk on behalf of Ukrainians or Russians?
So I think that, having sense of both of those, I can tell you that, unfortunately, Russian people have a different mentality. They're like Dmitry just mentioned, it's about only 30% of Russian people actually understand that there is a life outside of Russia. Many of them never left their own village.
Well, you can say the same about the Americans, by the way.
Well, in America, at least we I quite honestly, as many times as I travel throughout the United States, I didn't see people using the bathroom outside on the street. So,
okay, that's true. That's true.
Which is very common in Russia. Okay, in Ukraine, people are very, very integrated in European society. The country itself much smaller, but they're actually fighting for their freedom, and that's what I'm willing to fight with them, because I think people do have a right to live in the free country. If you compare Russia and Ukraine at that point, like Putin been in office for what, 23 years now? I think he overdid the Brezhnev at that point. And during all this time, Ukraine had what, about 4 or 5 different presidents. So they're not just fighting for freedom, they're fighting for their democracy. And I think that's what we're here stand for. So that's why I think it's our obligation to help them to fight that game. It's actually, unfortunately, what I hear and what I see is going on right now. And quite honestly, I talk to many people in Russia, and I see how many people fled Russia anywhere. Name the country, they're there. Armenia, Georgia, Turkey, Bulgaria, all over. It's same thing as Ukrainians, but Ukrainians are running from the war. Russians are running from the regime, because they're not able to speak freely anymore. People are get threatened. People are thrown in jail. It's horrible what's going on there.
Thank you, Rina. Does anybody want to say something, or we can move on to really discussing more propaganda, because we haven't talked to propaganda in the U.S. We haven't.
I do want to add something to that. As an American, looking from the outside, someone very wise once said that during the American Revolution, he said, I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees. And I think this is a sentiment that's held by a lot of Ukrainians. All the Ukrainians that I've talked to, are saying, we're not fighting. We're not just fighting for an abstract thought. We're fighting for our very existence, for our freedom. We've lived under a Soviet rule already. We've lived under their control already, and we will never go back to that again. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's so difficult, for Ukrainians. It's hard for them to leave their country. The native Ukrainians that are there, it's very difficult for them to leave their country, because this is their home, and they love their home country. They love their people. They love the culture, and as do I. But they understand the difference. They understand the importance of freedom, and they do not want to give that up. Looking from the outside in, I can see that there is a determination by the Ukrainian people not to submit to tyranny. They just will not do it. And I'm very, very proud of the Ukrainian people for that. As a Texan, I mean, this is a value, a value that we hold very, very dear. We will not submit to tyranny, and they are refusing to do so. And they are giving actually the largest country in the world, a fight that was supposed to last 2 weeks, has been going on for 2 years. And for me, this is incredible. And the determination of the Ukrainian people is just amazing to me.
Great.
I can speak. I'd like to share for a second, if I can.
Sure, go ahead.
As difficult as it is to try to, speak from the Russian perspective, because of the things that people have mentioned, the oppressiveness, I think it's difficult to voice that perspective, but I feel like in the spirit of diplomacy, it's necessary to try to understand both sides, even if it's difficult. My understanding is that, Russia felt pushed into trying to overthrow the government in Ukraine because, as you were saying about Yanukovych being a Russian puppet, I've looked into that, and he was actually very, very much looking to the EU. He wanted to do the deal with the EU. Ukraine was very much in debt at that time. That EU deal was not really very good financially. It was very expensive. There's a lot of stuff that they had to do the EU deal. Also, they went to the IMF and tried to get a loan, and they accepted the Russian offer because the Russian offer was a better short-term deal, not because Russia was oppressively using them as a puppet, from what I understand. And I've read the details of the meeting, and they were offended that the EU deal didn't offer EU membership. And so I guess, with America's presence and America being on the ground, on the mics during the Maidan, Victoria Nuland being on tape discussing who to put in the interim government, them being photographed with McCain being photographed with people on the far right. leading to these two breakaway regions, and leading to, I think Putin seeing that, it was just a matter of time with the Americans being involved, which they did become heavily involved in the country. Biden was heavily involved for 8 years, weapons, economic interests, all that stuff. They could see that Crimea would be taken back. And then, Zelensky couldn't let it be. He did Operation Seabreeze 2021. They did NATO weapons parade in the Black Sea for 2 weeks. And he did the Crimea platform, which he, was trying to gather global support for taking back Crimea. And the breakaway regions, erupting into a civil war that, in my opinion, just giving these small regions their autonomy to do what they wanted would have prevented this whole thing. And I think that that's how Russia sees it. Like, the 14,000 people that died in the Donbas, the water being cut off to Crimea for 8 years, from the river. I think that, if Minsk II would have been enacted and they wouldn't have decided to take back Crimea, this war never would have happened.
Krista, just a small comment. We can go on for another 30 minutes to finish up with all of our questions, if you don't mind. Those of you who need to leave, you can leave, but if you can stay for another half hour, then we can actually go on, finish all the questions.
That's all I was going to say.
I'm fine with that.
Wonderful. We can go on. Dmitry, please, you want to say something?
Yes, I wanted to say something very important, which I mentioned in my blog post that I made yesterday, but I think it's critically important. So actually, and people underestimate the impact of it. So in November 2022, Hague's district court, it's not the same as International Criminal Court, but it is still Hague's court that had jurisdiction over the case. It did close the case and issued a verdict for MH17 Boeing downing in Ukraine in 2014. And so the full text of verdict in English, I will share the link in the chat. And it says, so among other things, the court is not only determines who is guilty, it also determines the facts, establishes the facts. And the facts established by like a Hague's court working for 8 years on this case is probably much more legitimate than any kind of propaganda or, kitchen talks about this. And what the court has discovered is that at least since May 2014, Russia was the main actor on the battle. It was actually everything happening in Donbas was organized and controlled by Russia, even though not all of the people there were Russians. Some of them were Ukrainians, homegrown, but they were still under command from Putin. So, and Russia as a country was main supplier of heavy weapons, probably the only supplier of heavy weapons. So it's main actor and the only supplier. So this whole idea that people of Donbas have expressed their view to separate is all completely garbage and wrong, as court has determined. So it was Russian occupation since 2014, and it was covert occupation with enough lies to confuse leaders of Western countries and people across the world. And now we have court decision, finally. I mean, I'm surprised so many people still didn't familiarize themselves with it. So that's why I had to bring this up.
Thank you, Dmitry. Okay. Does anybody want to comment, or we can move on to the propaganda questions?
Yeah, I don't want to, it's going to be too long. Sorry.
Okay.